Buenos días, bienvenidas, bienvenidos a esta ceremonia de clausura de la 7ª edición de la Cátedra INDITEX-UDC de Responsabilidad y de Innovación Social. Un gran honor tener hoy con nosotros a Dan Rees, una persona absolutamente de lujo, si la palabra se puede utilizar, en el mundo de la sostenibilidad, de la responsabilidad social, de la innovación social, del compromiso de las empresas con la sostenibilidad, con esa parte que hemos estudiado en la cátedra necesaria de la sostenibilidad, que es, además de la que corresponde al buen gobierno corporativo, además de la que corresponde a la sostenibilidad medioambiental, el compromiso de las empresas con los sectores de la población en riesgo de exclusión directamente vinculados a su modelo de negocio. A estas alturas de la promoción, ya los alumnos pues conocéis perfectamente todo esto, pero bueno está decirlo y bueno está insistir en este tema. Por supuesto, darle muchísimas gracias a nuestro conferenciante hoy, porque es un gran honor tenerle hoy aquí. Yo tengo que disculpar la ausencia del rector y de la vicerrectora de Responsabilidad Social y del campus de Ferrol, Araceli Torres, que nos acompaña siempre en estas efemérides, que por compromisos absolutamente previos e ineludibles pues no nos pueden acompañar, pero me han dicho que por supuesto les encantaría estar aquí y que no están presentes, pero sí lo están de alma y de corazón. Bueno, tiene ahora la palabra la directora de esta cátedra, Marta Rey.
Muchísimas gracias. Presidente del Consejo Social de la Universidad de A Coruña, director de Better Work, vicerrector, autoridades, alumnos del curso de especialización en responsabilidad e innovación social, el CERIS, que hoy egresáis, antiguos alumnos de la cátedra INDITEX-UDC de responsabilidad social, colaboradores y amigos. Dear Dan, first of all, it's our privilege to share with you this graduation ceremony, and thanks so much for accepting our invitation to lecture. Podría estar hablando en castellano porque Dan habla castellano, pero para facilitar. Hoy es un día...
Today is a great day, and I have three main feelings. First of all, I'm thankful. Secondly, I feel proud, and I also feel hopeful.
Agradecimiento muy sincero a todas las organizaciones y personas comprometidas con este proyecto que ya empieza a ser una...
Commitment to this project, which is now a reality 8 years later. First of all, thanks to INDITEX. Thanks for their generous commitment and support, the ongoing support that we have received from INDITEX so as to promote CSR and sustainability in our community, and thank you for doing it in cooperation with the public university. I also should say that INDITEX, apart from financing all of the activities in the chair, the work team from INDITEX are often involved in all of our activities. They actually teach ordinary sessions, they invite speakers, they host extraordinary meetings such as the one organized by the students in the 7th edition with a group of universities, with a group of students from a Chinese university. So thank you very much, INDITEX, and the whole of the sustainability team represented by Antonio Abril, representative from the board of INDITEX. Also thanks to the rectors and the team, the vice rector, as well as the dean Calvo from the business administration school, because we often celebrate many of our events there. Thanks for your ongoing involvement with all the activities of the chair, and I have to say that they do so from my university, the University of A Coruña, which is outstanding in the Galician public university system. First of all, because this university has promoted the transfer of knowledge between university and the corporations. Also because they believe that sustainability is the way to go for the university, and also because the vice rectorship is exclusively devoted to CSR. Also thanks to Antonio Abril for his ongoing commitment. This is an institutional thanks to him as president of the Council of CSR of the University of A Coruña, but also my personal thanks because he believes in corporate social responsibility. He's like an apostle of CSR, and Antonio is firmly convinced that the collaboration between society, university, and corporations is the key, the foundations to the sustainable development of Galicia. He has believed so from the very beginning, when this was just a project on paper. Finally, thanks, last but not least, to the whole group of collaborators of this edition, led by Vanessa Mato. Thank you very much, Vanessa, for your work, for your efforts, to Jesus Esposito and the rest of the team from the Social Council, to the alumni who have mentored some practical projects to the collaborating entities, and also thanks to the mentor who has provided support to them. I also have a feeling of pride, and I think this is the right time to share with all of you the pride that we feel witnessing the amazing job you have all done. This has been the most intense edition with regard to number of workshops, extracurricular visits, etc. You know very well about that, and I think you're carrying home a lot of seeds, a lot of experiences, so now it is your turn. That's the problem with doing a specialization course on CSR, that as soon as you finish, you become very much aware of your responsibilities to society. So I'm sure you're going to sow those seeds, because they will be there for you to use in the future. And I also feel hopeful. I am very hopeful about the great impact of this social innovation project. After 7 editions, the figures that we have achieved are very big. There are actually 214 alumni. We have around 100 application forms per academic year, 22 visiting speakers, 45 practical projects which have been implemented, and a very high rates of assessment of our projects. But there are also signs beyond figures which are exciting. There are signs that the seeds which have been sown in the world of CSR are actually giving fruit. The percentage of alumni who is now holding positions related to CSR keeps growing. The proposals for new collaborative projects are abundant, and those who have actually collaborated in the past end up by implementing proposals that stem from this course, and the level of acknowledgement of the topics related to the chair is very, very high compared to what it was 8 years ago. So I would like to invite all of those who complete their training today to remain in the network, because it's very important to count on you so as to implement, so as to put into practice the theory of the chair. So thank you very much, and congrats. Thank you very much, Marta. On my behalf, let me just highlight the importance of the keynote speaker and the representation that he's making. Better Work is a joint program of the ILO, established in 2007, after the success of the Better Factories Cambodia project of the ILO. The main characteristic of Better Work, as has been heard before, and actually we try to invite speakers who gather all those characteristics Better Work is an initiative that aims at bringing together under the same umbrella multinational corporations, governments, workers, unions, etc., so as to improve the working conditions in the garment sector. Right now, these programs are implemented in 8 countries comprising 1,500 factories, and the countries where the programs are implemented are Cambodia, Haiti, Jordan, Lesotho, Indonesia, Vietnam, Nicaragua, and Bangladesh. There are 3 legs to the program. Let me just describe them. First of all, activities for the assessment of factories' compliance. You all know what that means. You should get used to hearing about compliance because it's becoming more and more important. Compliance means establishing management systems for reducing and preventing risks. So it's both about prevention and management of risk with the purpose of reducing and minimizing the risks. So auditors pay visits to factories so as to make sure that they comply with basic labor and safety requirements. The people from Better Work believe in ongoing improvement through dialogue with employers and workers, and as a result, they will periodically issue situation reports, and they also have a commitment with the stakeholders. When you express your commitment to the program and the activities, you have to do it at every level from the point of view of the employers and the corporations. It has actually improved the working and living conditions of workers all over the world. I like to quote some excerpts from their website. I have actually visited their website, so I'm going to quote now from their own website. And we can read that, for instance, in Lesotho, 100% of the factories that they're working with have got rid of discrimination against HIV workers. In Vietnam, 75% of factories have increased their turnover, 62% have increased their production capacity, and 60% of factories have increased their employment rates. The programs have a very sustainable design. Donor countries such as the USA provide funds in order to execute the programs, and international suppliers are in charge of covering the audit costs. There are important multinational corporations involved, such as Inditex. We have signed the protocol in 2007. In 2013, we signed a specific cooperation agreement with Better Work so that Inditex is direct buyer and partner in the Better Work program. There are many important corporations, such as Levi, H&M, Gap, etc. The goal of Better Work is to achieve the financial sustainability of the programs in a period from 5 to 7 years. Our keynote speaker, Rees, is involved in other associations with the same purpose, improving the working conditions in the garment industry. We know very well many of them. For instance, he is the president of the management board of the Bangladesh agreement, but has played a key role in the implementation of the Rana Plaza agreement. I'm afraid you have all heard about the Rana Plaza disaster, perhaps the greatest labor disaster in the whole world. A factory collapsed in Bangladesh in April 2013, causing the death of 1,100 people and causing around 2,500 casualties. So in the garment industry, there's a difficult relationship between employers and workers, and we often say that there is before and after Rana Plaza. So as a result of the disaster, there was an ongoing international cooperation process launched with the aim of helping Bangladeshi workers to be protected by international working standards, and also with the purpose of improving the safety conditions of the factories. From 2009 to 2010, Dan Rees was the first director of the Ethical Trade Initiative from the UK, an institution that is well known by Inditex if we now go to the website of this institution, they say they want to be a leading alliance among corporations, unions, and third sector entities with the goal of promoting workers' rights across the world. They say our vision is a world where every worker is free from exploitation and discrimination and can enjoy freedom, safety, and fairness at the workplace. He's a leading expert in CSR, undoubtedly. He has advised numerous international organizations and governments on better practices for improving working conditions in the supply chains. Actually, it's a great honor, it's a real pleasure to listen to Dan today. So let's listen to Dan, and then we will have a Q&A session that I'm sure you will all enjoy.
So Dan, as a conclusion, thank you very much again for coming here, for joining us in this closing ceremony of our postgraduate course of Social Innovation and Social Responsibility. A great honor and great pleasure. Now you have the floor, and after we'll open, if you agree, a turn of questions. Okay?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for those kind words, Antonio, Marta. Buenos días, gracias, Inditex UDC, por la oportunidad de hablar aquí. I learned my Spanish many years ago from farmers in Nicaragua, and it's probably best that I give this speech in English. If you please, I'll do that. Firstly, and I think importantly, I wanted to congratulate all of the graduates here today for graduating from the CSR course. It's an achievement. I know that it's a very intense course. I know it's a very innovative course. I'm very impressed by what I've heard, and it's my personal privilege to be here and speak with you on this important occasion. So public concern for conditions of work in global supply chains remains very strong. The issue also remains very high on the political agenda of many governments, certainly that we deal with in the International Labour Organization and the United Nations. And I think this is partly explained by the growing realization that good jobs are fundamental to sustainable development. The international consensus embodied in the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals to bring poverty to an end in all its forms by 2030 is clear, and so is the fact that decent work in global supply chains really lies at the heart of a strategy to do this. Good jobs in global supply chains can be the engine of that growth. The United Nations Conference on Trade and Development estimates that 80% of global trade is now linked to globalized production networks. Good working conditions in global supply chains has never been so relevant to the international system or to development. Now, it's now over 25 years, I was listening to Antonio about myself, and it's now over 25 years since global companies accepted this moral responsibility to improve the labor practices of those firms that supply them with products. I think it was Levi Strauss & Co., the denim company that is often cited as the first company to do this in 1991. And since then, tens of thousands of companies have followed suit and are monitoring conditions for millions of workers around the world. So the principle of due diligence is now very well established. Indeed, it's becoming a legal obligation in some jurisdictions. And instruments such as the Organization of Economic Development and Cooperation, their guidelines for multinational enterprises, the ILO's own Multinational Enterprises Declaration, and the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, these all set clear responsibilities and guidelines for business to do this. 25 years ago, I was working with international NGOs advocating that companies such as Inditex should take up this responsibility. And at that time, many of us had really high hopes for the success of this strategy. We felt that the commercial success and the leverage that big companies had developed in the global marketplace had proved very effective to enable them to specify product quality or product safety standards, so why not labor standards? And the aim at that time was to harness these new incentives from the market to improve the access that workers have to their rights in places where governments and industrial relations were not delivering this. And people often ask me now to quantify what's the success of all these efforts, all these hundreds of CSR efforts from different companies around the world in the garment sector and indeed in other sectors. And in truth, it's a very difficult question to answer conclusively and empirically. Speaking generally, I think we have to be really quite humble about the achievements that have been made so far against the scale of the challenge and the need. The reality of working conditions for many workers in global supply chains falls very short of national law and international labor standards, and I think it still falls short of customers' expectations that buy clothes around the world. The global garment industry, for example, still has excessive working hours, is characterized by low wages, and restrictions on fundamental freedoms, such as the freedom of association or the right to collective bargaining, and freedom from discrimination are still commonplace. This is a reality. We all deal with it. However, it's also true that there have been important improvements in working conditions and in creating awareness, indeed the expectation that companies have a responsibility to ensure due diligence. So I think the most fruitful question to ask is, what have we learned from CSR efforts to improve working conditions in supply chains? What have we learned that's really going to point us for more successful strategies in the future? And this is the subject I'd like to speak to you about. And I'd like to answer the question in three ways. First, drawing on my experience of working with the global garment industry over the last 20 years, I will suggest two lessons that I think could inform a more sustainable, impactful approach in the future. Second, I'd like to draw on my experience at the ILO in the last 8 years, and we've attempted to apply these lessons in a unique program called Better Work in the global garment sector. And I'll draw on some research on the impact of the program to try and shine a light on what we think is working and why. And then lastly, I'll conclude with a personal view of what I think these lessons tell us about where CSR should go in the future. So what have we learned from CSR efforts to improve supplier labor practices? And in reflecting on my personal experience of working with hundreds of businesses in the garment sector as well as workers' organizations and governments, I think there are two main lessons that we should take to heart. And the first lesson is about the importance of more collaborative approaches and partnerships across the industry to address the really deep-rooted issues that lead to poor working conditions in supply chains. Too often I see companies with a strategy to work directly with their suppliers in isolation of their competitors or with governments and other key change agents. And the second lesson is about the importance of empowering workers, and particularly women workers, to enable them to bring their voice and their legitimate interests, which I believe must be at the center of a sustainable change process. And too often, I think CSR is something that is done by business on behalf of workers but doesn't really involve them. So allow me to explain a little bit these further thoughts. So if you look at how companies have dealt with some issues, some fundamental rights such as child labor and forced labor, I think it's interesting. So the overriding motivation for most companies that adopted codes of labor practice 2 decades ago was to manage risks to their reputation, and I think it still is. And the issue that chief executives that I spoke to in those days feared the most was child labor. The media images of children producing clothes caused huge reputational damages for some brands like Gap in the US or Marks & Spencer in the UK, where I come from. And CSR programs in the industry really focused on this issue. They had a zero-tolerance culture with their suppliers on this issue. And as a result, I think it's now relatively rare to find underage workers in formal work in garment manufacturing export factories. I think it's still a concern about unsafe work for young people, but by and large, child labor in those factories has been greatly reduced. And the ILO's own global estimates on the prevalence of child labour also indicate that while still a pressing problem, the world is really moving towards that goal of elimination. While 152 million children remain in child labour, there were almost 134 million fewer children in employment in 2006 than there were at the turn of this century. So we see huge advances in the fight against child labour. But it's not all good news. While child labour has significantly reduced in the formal sector, in the organised export factories, research consistently shows that children are working in other parts of the supply chain, such as cotton harvesting, ginning, or subcontracted manufacturing. And it's a similar story of partial progress in the effort to eliminate forced labour or modern slavery. Growing global concern and increased political momentum for the eradication of modern slavery has really compelled a lot of companies to make this a very big priority. And last year, the ILO published global estimates that estimate that 25 million people are working in conditions of modern slavery. Now, 15% of those are working in the manufacturing sector, including in garments. And research cites outsourced production of garments in Asia that rely on migrant workers and document concerns such as excessive working hours, payment of high recruitment fees, illegal retention of passports, and in some cases, illegal imprisonment and beating of workers. And the increased movement of migrant workers and refugees leaves many vulnerable to exploitation. So what are the lessons from this kind of experience? And I think that addressing child labour and forced labour in a sustainable way requires more than the earnest efforts of companies monitoring their direct suppliers. Robust due diligence and sustainable remedies requires companies to develop partnerships with non-business actors and the empowerment of workers to protect themselves. So, for example, to be effective in addressing child labour, global companies must develop more traceability of their supply chains, develop strategies to exercise more influence in the secondary tiers of their supply chains where child labour and indeed forced labour may exist. And this inevitably means developing partnerships with non-business actors to address the complex causes of child labour, such as rural poverty, low wages, or lack of quality education, things that companies can't fix by themselves but do need to be addressed to eradicate the problem. Similarly, countries face huge challenges in eliminating slavery from the supply chain. A vital first step is to monitor and predict the risk that workers in the supply chain may be caught in conditions of forced labour and trafficking. But the innovative strategies that are emerging to detect remedy of forced labour require partnership and collaboration among businesses with workers' organisations who can empower them. So let me give you an example. The ILO's Fair Recruitment Initiative has developed what we call a fair recruitment corridor for workers from Nepal working in Jordan, where 75% of the workforce in the garment sector are migrant workers. Workers are informed of their rights and contractual obligations before they make the choice to migrate. No recruitment fees are charged to workers, and the mechanism enables the recruitment agency to transparently demonstrate that workers are migrating in fair conditions, and the supplier, the manufacturer, can use those recruitment agencies that are making those commitments. Workers are empowered to make better decisions regarding their employment choices and benefit from greater transparency of conditions, and their membership of a trade union in Jordan helps monitor those conditions. So it's these kind of partnerships I'm thinking of to deal with these complex problems. But what about, Antonio mentioned the Rana Plaza incident, and establishing safe and healthy workplaces, I think, remains a big motivating factor for those calling for greater corporate responsibility. 20 years ago, the toy and garments industries in particular were dealing with the reality of frequent and sometimes devastating fires in factories and dormitories, especially in South China. So I think companies have been very focused right from the beginning on trying to make their suppliers more safe workplaces. And I think collective experience has shown that through sustained and persistent action, global brands have had very positive impacts. Initiatives to remove harmful chemicals from the manufacturing processes, banning dangerous practices like sandblasting denim have really removed serious hazard and the likelihood of injury and occupational diseases. From monitoring of compliance related to chemicals in garment factories in Vietnam, Better Work has seen a 40% relative reduction in non-compliance of chemical management over the course of the last 5 years. We do see improvement. And the collapse of the Rana Plaza building, to which Antonio referred, and the devastating effects that had, I think also teaches us other lessons. You know, the building contained 5 factories and I think 300 small businesses. And the building collapsed, as you know, under its own weight, leading to a catastrophic loss of life. And what the incident told us was that there was really a failure of building regulators, of building planners, and of safety checks at every level in the construction and maintenance of that building. But the issue that continues to haunt me is that workers knew that building was unsafe. The day before the collapse, the city authorities were called to inspect the building and potentially shut it down. Workers expressed grave fears to their unions and others about the safety of that building, but under pressure from their employers, they went back inside. And you know what happened. So I think the point is that if workers had had the confidence, if they were empowered to refuse unsafe work, then that building collapse would not have killed hundreds of people and injured many more. And you know, I think this is something to keep at the top of our minds. And if the scale and the shock of Rana Plaza are unique, the incidents of severe injury and death in the workplace are certainly not. The International Labour Organization estimates that nearly 2.3 million people lose their lives due to unsafe working conditions every year. An astonishing 160 million people contract occupational diseases. So again, the important lesson from this experience is that safety is not just about buildings and managing risks. Ultimately, it's about empowering people to take control of their working environment. Safe work is about empowering people in the workplace to understand and monitor their own safety and to act on that, quickly and effectively. What about wages and working hours? 2 issues that perhaps are of the most concern to workers in the global garment industry. I think while some companies have made headway with key suppliers in improving incomes and reducing working hours, it's really hard to see more than isolated examples of progress in an industry where minimum wages are still considered very low and working hours can be very long. And compliance monitoring data from the ILO shows that violations of law regulating the amount of overtime hours are really stubbornly persistent. Upwards of 7 out of 10 of garment factories in Indonesia, for example, remain non-compliant in these areas despite lots of support and engagement on the issue. And last year, the ILO published a study of 12 Asian countries, concluding that while wages in Asia's garment and footwear sector have increased in recent years, they continue to remain low overall, and particularly for women. The ILO estimated that an average earnings were less than $200 a month in the 8 countries where the data was available, and that it was as low as $100 a month in some countries. And while women account for the great majority of jobs in the sector, they continue to be paid an average wage less than men. So again, I think the lessons, as with child labour and safety and working hours, is these are not simple processes to deal with, and it's not just a business issue. There's a common assumption that by increasing prices to suppliers for wages that workers will rise. And while price paid is a key factor, sustainable improvements in wages are also determined by minimum wage regulations and bargaining between workers and employers. And global brands like Inditex, driven by CSR motives, can act to influence these outcomes, but they certainly don't control them. What's needed is partnerships and social dialogue. So let me move on, and I'd like to, just holding those lessons in mind, that we need more social dialogue and we need stronger partnerships to really affect those issues. I'd like to explain to you a bit about the program that I'm responsible for at the International Labour Organization called Better Work. And Antonio introduced this, but let me just start by saying this is a partnership between the International Labour Organization and the World Bank's International Finance Corporation. It's a partnership that goes back 10 years, and our aim, working together, is to improve working conditions in global garment factories around the world and also improve the competitiveness of those firms at the same time. And our thesis right from the beginning was that good working conditions could be implemented in a sustainable way that could be good for business. And what we were really after was finding out how to do that. The partnership includes, we work with all businesses in the supply chain, over 100 global brands and manufacturers, 1,500 manufacturers employing over 2 million workers. And we work with the trade unions and employers and governments in each of those countries. And what we're trying to do is align the interests of workers and managers in the workplace with the interests of the firms in the supply chain and the government and social partners to drive the improvement process. And to make it really simple, what we do, we go into factories and we assess the compliance of those factories to national labour law and international labour standards. We produce an action plan, and we make the report and the action plan available to the customers of the factory, the global brands. We spend most of our time training and building the capacity of workers and employers in the workplace to deal with the problems. We invest in dialogue between those parties to understand the issues and to act upon them and to build their capacity to deal with it in many different ways. Now, around 2010, we developed a partnership with a university in America called Tufts University. We committed to an independent process of impact assessment where they would follow the work that we did over a 5-year period and measure the impact of what we did. What we knew at the time, which is shown in this chart, was that we were bringing compliance rates, non-compliance rates down across almost all conditions of work in all the countries where we work, and that's what this chart shows. We knew that was happening, but we didn't know why. We didn't know what was really having the impact, and we didn't know if things were improving for workers or not. Really, what about at the level of their household, and what did it mean for firms in the supply chain? So we commissioned this independent impact assessment really to understand these questions. It's a unique exercise. It remains the largest study of its kind ever done to collect firm-level data in this way over a time-bound period and in an academically rigorous way. And it relies on over 15,000 worker surveys and 2,000 surveys of managers in those factories over that time period. And what it shows us is a number of things. The first, it concludes, as our compliance data showed, that we as a program are improving working conditions. And you see a list of those on this slide. But they include a decline in the incidence of forced labor. Where we found forced labor, particularly in Jordan, we were effective over time at working with the industry to eliminate that problem. The program contributed directly to a decline in workers' concerns about abusive practices such as verbal abuse and sexual harassment. It led to a decrease in workers' concerns with low pay and excessive overtime, and a decrease in abuse of short-term probationary contracts. And each of these improvements are measured empirically in terms of percentage reduction of these non-compliances in the different countries. And crucially for workers, it also led to an increase in pay. And here's an example here. This chart shows you over a 5-year period in Vietnam, what the researchers identified as the unique contribution of the Better Work program to improving the weekly pay of the workers by encouraging compliance to national laws, by supporting processes of improvement in the minimum wage, by encouraging workers received all benefits under law. they benefited on average $15 a week in terms of their take-home pay. But what was really interesting to us was what was the impact on business. And the researchers concluded in many different ways, in many different studies across the different countries studied, that improving working conditions is actually an investment, it's not a cost. That there are really concrete benefits for garment manufacturers to improve working conditions. And I mean this really concretely. Of those firms we work with across the different countries that we work with, those who pay the workers the most and those in which the workers work the least are the most profitable enterprises. And we saw this time and time again in different studies that were made. The researchers concluded that better working conditions is driving higher productivity. One example in Vietnam that showed that in those firms where workers said that they understood what they should be paid and they were paid that, where they didn't feel discriminated against or subject to verbal abuse, and where they felt they were treated with respect and the food was good, in these conditions, the firms where workers said those things were true were on average 8% more profitable than the firms where the workers said those things were not true. Clear benefits. The researchers also concluded that by the 5th year of participation in the Better Work Vietnam program, the average factory sees a 25% increase in profitability. And there were a number of reasons given for that. So clear benefits for firms that make these improvements. This chart here looks at the relationship between isolating two factors, verbal abuse and sexual harassment. And what it shows on one axis is the vertical axis is profitability, and the horizontal axis is verbal abuse. And it clearly shows for those firms in the far left corner of those charts, those are the most profitable, have the least abuse. And these factors are extremely important to workers' ability to stay in the factory, to work hard in the factory, to be productive in those factories. So the researchers isolated a number of particularly important factors to workers, and I just want to talk about two of them briefly. The first thing driving improvement is the quality of the dialogue in the factory. We work very hard at improving the working conditions, but also improving the dialogue. And here you see a picture of a committee run by Better Work of managers and workers in a factory working out problems that have arisen from our assessment process. So the quality of the dialogue and the gender composition of the dialogue of the committee really affects its effectiveness and the ability to drive progress in the factory, but also speed up the production process. And the second issue here is that social dialogue works most when workers are freely elected to those committees, when they engage freely in that, and when they're equally represented. And what I mean by that is where women are equally represented on those committees to men. And that's absolutely crucial. We saw the dialogue mechanism work when these two factors are there, and we saw the dialogue mechanism work less well when those two factors were not there. And the kind of improvements that this dialogue process drives is better relationships with the supervisors, is better health outcomes, a better working environment, reduced sexual harassment and verbal abuse, reduced discrimination, all of which come directly from a process of engaging workers in the improvement process and speeding up the communication and allowing channels for complaint and resolution of disputes. The other big issue that the researchers identified was about the empowerment of women. And I've already spoken about this in respect to the importance of women's representation and leadership. But we were stunned by the strength of the conclusions that the researchers found in the different countries where they looked in terms of the impact of really enabling women to have voice and to participate more fully in the business. So one example, one of the things we do is we take supervisors, so those who are, most workers' direct experience of management is the supervisor on the production line, so it's a low level of management. And so one of the things we target very closely is to give a lot of training to that supervisor in terms of their ability to communicate with workers' representatives and to resolve issues in the factory. And what the researchers did, they did a randomized control trial across 7 countries, and they looked at factories where we hadn't yet done this training, and they looked at factories where we had done this training. And what they found is that that training improves the productivity in factories by up to 22%, in that production line, by up to 22%. Okay? So this is an extraordinary productivity balance from just simple training of bringing supervisors together and taking production managers and turning them into people managers. But the significant thing was the biggest improvement to productivity happened in factories where those trained were women. Okay? When they isolated the women to go through that leadership training, that's where the improvement was found. Much more so than when they were men. And perhaps this isn't surprising given the makeup of the workforce. But it told us a valuable lesson about the importance of enabling women to participate and to lead in businesses where they are often not given much voice. Okay? The final point I want to make about this research is that good jobs, better jobs, are not just good for workers, and not just a better way to do business, but they're good for development. And what we've begun to understand, and we still have much more work to do here, is that what do workers do with more money if they get money? What do they do with more time if they get money? And what we're seeing is a big health and education dividend. Workers use that money initially to begin to pay off debts, to begin supporting other family members that have debts, but pretty soon, when they're in a position to, particularly women, spend that money on the education of siblings, including women and girls, and access to healthcare. And so we see that each year, workers stay in a better work factory, their access to health and education gets stronger. And that child health is particularly related to the decrease in working hours and the increase in pay. So, our conclusion is clear that better jobs are not just good for workers and businesses, they're good for development, and they make a sensible development strategy. And lastly, bringing it back to the role of CSR and the role of global brands. Now, and I should say that actively, companies like Inditex participate in this work, support the improvement process, and are a big part of this story. But the research also found that the sourcing practices of global companies have an important role in improving working conditions. So the research shows that, that sourcing practices can put production schedules under pressure. So, for example, we worked in Vietnam to reduce the chronic working hours, the number of factories that had chronic working hours from 90% to 50% of the factories we were working with. But we were aware at any time those factories could come into non-compliance by receiving a last-minute order from a company. And when that happened, it begins to stress the production process. And a stressed production process leads to stressed managers and stressed workers. And that's when we see a rise in harassment, including sexual harassment, and more dangerous working practices. So really, one of the biggest causes of chronic overtime in the industry still remains with the lead firms in the global supply chains and the way they put orders into factories. And bear in mind that many factories take many orders from many different companies, and these schedules can be enormously difficult to manage. But we also saw links between the way suppliers were paid. There is a direct relationship, the researchers concluded, between the late payment of orders, or if it takes a company a long time to pay orders to the supplier, there's a direct relationship between that and whether or not the workers will be paid, or whether they'll be paid on time, or they'll be underpaid. And so we see these concrete relationships between business practices in the supply chain and the supplier's ability to make improvement. So let me conclude by drawing some conclusions about taking these lessons, what does it tell us about where we should go from here? Where should CSR develop in the future? And I think I'd like to offer a personal view from working with the industry about what I think the priorities are. And if I had 5 recommendations to make to big businesses who really wanted to make an impact, I think this is what they would be. The first one is, I think companies need to get a bolder vision of the future they want. I've argued on the one hand that CSR efforts are fragmented and they lack impact against the scale of the challenges they face. And that it's not just a business problem. Business need partnerships and inclusion of workers to tackle these root causes. But I've also argued, and I believe we have the data to show this, that good jobs are not just good for workers, they're good for business and good for development. So if you believe that's true, I think it's time for a bolder and a more positive vision for the role that responsible corporations can play in creating better jobs in global supply chains. Most CSR strategies that I see are still defensive, and they're still largely aimed at protecting brand. And I think it's time for a more positive and confident, optimistic vision about what contribution a company can make to development and to creating a better world. And a new vision is really needed to inspire and to lead. And if you believe that, then consider this. Over the next decade, the global garment industry, regardless of changes in technology, will employ millions of people in places that badly need jobs and for people who badly need jobs. 80% of those people will be women. Most of them will be young. Many will be migrants. And for many, it's their first paid job. And we know that if decent work benefits all, if that job is a good job, it's transformational. If that job, and it doesn't follow that it will be, but if that job is a good job, then it can lift millions of people out of poverty. And I think if you look at the global garment industry and what it does well, it has this potential to lift millions of people out of poverty, to empower women, and to really be an engine for inclusive growth. If we talk about inclusive growth, who are the people that need including? Well, they're young people, they're women, they're migrants, they're people at the bottom 40% of the global poor, and these are the people that work in garment factories. So I think just by focusing on getting the business right, focusing on making a greater job, the global garment industry could be have a massive impact on driving inclusive growth in less developed and middle-income countries around the world. And I think that's the kind of vision that the global garment industry needs to get behind. My second recommendation is to take CSR to the heart of your business model. The aim of CSR is to improve working conditions where needed and to do no harm. And yet we know that some of the core business practices of brands can undermine suppliers' ability to employ workers in decent conditions. I've talked about excessive working hours and the impact of late rush orders, and I've talked about the inability, if you like, of manufacturers. If they have a very short sight of their order book, they're very unlikely to make the kind of investment in their workforces needed to create decent jobs. So how do we get beyond that? How do we enable the business model to really contribute to a more stable workforce and to build better jobs throughout the supply chain? And I think this is really an issue of credibility that brands need to address in a much more robust way. My third recommendation is to aim to support stronger governance and not to avoid it. And what I mean by this isn't just a business issue. Poor working conditions prevail in places where garments are made, partly because government is weak. There is very little governance of the labour market. So what's needed is good law, well enforced. Corporate responsibility can't be an alternative to this, but I think it can help to build more effective governance. Do we want a future where companies are forever going to police the conditions of their business partners? Or is there a shared interest between the private sector and governments in establishing labour markets where the rule of law prevails? And I think there is, and I think we need to begin to sit down and talk about how that collaboration could work. Fourthly, and it follows from what I said, I think we need to build stronger collaboration and partnerships, including with workers' organisations. Antonio referenced the Bangladesh Accord. I think it's an amazing alliance between over 200 brands and 2 global unions, but that has really supported the industry in Bangladesh to make dramatic improvement in safety and seriously reduce the risk of catastrophic failure like Rana Plaza. So, I think this just inspires and gives an example of the kind of partnerships we need to see to really make sustained and improved impact in the business. I think Inditex is a pioneer of the Global Framework Agreement with the Global Union Industrial. More brands are now engaging in this kind of work. But this idea of providing a global structure and a mechanism to identify labour rights issues and address them collaboratively with workers' organisations and to build stronger processes for social dialogue in the industry is, I think, the kind of thing we need to see moving forward. Lastly and finally, I urge companies to be more transparent. I think too much that is done in the name of CSR operates in the dark, hidden behind confidentiality agreements or vague CSR reports. Putting information in the public domain challenges everybody to up their game and to act with integrity. And it challenges business partners to do their very best. And being open about who your suppliers are and what the issues are that you're working on, I think is a virtue, and it drives collaboration and change in the industry. This is the kind of transparency I think customers expect and the world is now ready for. So with that, I hope you found it useful and interesting. I hope as you draw your learning on what you found from the last 6 months and enter the world of work, that these thoughts are helpful to you. And once again, I thank you very much for listening and look forward to the celebration that's now about to begin. Thank you.